Good morning. Welcome to this webinar on food insecurity and its discontents in the Middle East and North Africa. I'm Karen Young. I'm a senior research scholar at Columbia University and the Center on Global Energy Policy. And it's my pleasure to host this discussion and presentation from Arab Barometer and the findings of their most recent survey work on the discontents on economic issues and particularly on food insecurity. We're joined by Salma Al-Shami, who is the Director of Research at Arab Barometer, by Michael Tancham, who is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in the program on economics and energy, and by Hafsa Halawa, who is also a non-resident scholar associated with MEI and a development specialist based in Dubai. So it's really a pleasure to have you all with us today. In our order of presentation, we're going to hear from Salma first, and she's going to go through some of the findings with us. And then we'll have some comments on the report from Michael and Hafsa. And we welcome questions, comments from our audience. You can use the Q&A function via Zoom to do that. We'd love to hear from you. We also can, to have a little bit of back and forth, I'll have some questions for the panelists. And just as a reminder, this is a series of presentations of the most recent Arab Barometer finding. So this is the second in a series of 4. There will be a discussion on climate and also on gender issues related to this most recent survey work. So stay tuned from MEI for information and dates on those. Let me turn it over to Salma. Thank you so much for this fantastic report and the work that you all have been doing at Arab Barometer. This is a really important one. And the full report, let me say that, is also available online. So you can find the link in our chat. Thanks, Salma.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks very much for that kind introduction. It's good to be back and sharing some of our latest findings with MEI and all who are attending here. To start off a little bit, for those of you who are not familiar with the Arab Barometer, we're a nonpartisan research network based out of Princeton University that looks into giving voice to citizens across the Middle East and North Africa on a variety of economic, social, political issues that affect their lives. We're the longest standing publicly available repository of data. All our data is accessible online. Our latest findings, the Wave 7 findings, which I will be talking about today, will be forthcoming in a few weeks. Information on the survey is actually already up, including our questionnaires and our technical reports. Our mission at the Arab Barometer is threefold. First, of course, to track the attitudes and behavior of citizens over time and within country. Second, and quite importantly, is to build institutional capacity. So to work extensively with our partners in the region, who are quintessential to kind of bringing this data to the world in kind of developing methodological and skill and listening to them, to what we need to adapt and alter, and kind of helping to provide those increased skill to actually get the best quality data we can get our hands on. And finally, to disseminate knowledge about citizens living in the Middle East and North Africa. To date, we have completed over 125,000 personal interviews through 87 nationally representative surveys across 15 countries, included in 7 different waves. The first wave of the Arab Barometer was carried out in 2006. The latest one was just now during COVID. We actually managed to do a phone survey, so some of the one of the first and widest of its type in the region. Our disaggregated data allows for both inter and intra-country kind of comparisons in addition to kind of tracking views over time. They're all open source and publicly available. We also have country and topic reports, including the one that has findings discussed today, are available for download, and those are actually in both English and Arabic. A little bit about Wave 7, which I'm about to discuss. We did 12 nationally representative surveys of citizens ages 18 and over. Today's presentation and this report will be discussing 10 of those, as 2 kind of came in a little later. We've done more than 26,000 personal interviews for this round that are conducted face-to-face in the respondents' place of residence. Our fielding dates were from October 2021 to July 2022, and those dates are really key to note here because, of course, of the ramifications of the war in Ukraine on food insecurity. Of the 10 countries I'll be discussing today, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Mauritania, Palestine, and Tunisia were actually all completed before the incursion began on February 22nd. Jordan, Libya, and Sudan started in January, so just a month before, but kind of continued into, and then finally Morocco was started and completed between March and April 2022, so well after. The response rates vary from country to country, anywhere between 17 and 74%, and they're fielded by our local partners. The questionnaire for this wave was comprised of more than 300 questions that are mostly closed-ended on a variety of topics, both that we've been tracking over time and kind of ones that are designed to kind of capture, of course, more recent events, including COVID-19, some deep dives and expanded batteries on gender norms, discrimination, various ecologies of inequality, so both socioeconomic and social and identity-based, and of course, climate and the environment, among others. And so in addition to looking at trends over time and allowing for comparisons within and between countries, kind of the breadth of Arab Barometer topics also allows for investigating how these different aspects of life in surveyed countries intersect. And that intersectionality really stands out when considering food insecurity. It's a lens that really magnifies several of the challenges that are confronting various countries in the region. So one of the most stark kind of findings that came back this wave was that majorities in 4 countries and almost half in an additional 2 say that they often or sometimes ran out of food. Additionally, we're seeing that kind of democracy fatigue is highest among the food insecure, although they do still prefer democracy to its alternatives. But food insecurity is an interesting link that complicates kind of perceptions of what type of government should be best and what citizens really want. With respect to kind of gender divides, women are more likely than men to report that food insufficiency, and these really reiterate the consequences of gender imbalances in labor force participation. With respect to climate change, food insecure citizens are less actually likely to want government intervention to address climate challenges, potentially signaling that they actually there might be a need for a reframing of the issue to kind of, because the causal chain linking climate change to food insecurity is perhaps a little long. So a little would go a long way in kind of in reframing how that issue gets discussed, I think. And finally, interestingly, differences between food insecure and secure citizens on evaluations of the economy are actually more muted, but that actually might have to do with the fact that overall the most citizens suggest that the economy is not doing well in their countries. So these intersectional factors are important not only as a starting point for more in-depth research and kind of investigating causality, but also I think it points to issues for policy considerations, right? So many responses that we've seen in the region to combating food insecurity have been emergency stopgap measures, which of course makes sense, from subsidies to centrally imposed food caps on foods and stipends. But and again, there's a necessary solution for somebody who's hungry today, and a solution 2 years from now won't really help. But it does kind of start the inquiry into assessing, how dealing with this short-term problem also means that dealing with these other issues will help address it in the future. Okay, so perhaps we've in 4 out of 10 countries included in this report, majorities of citizens say that the food that they bought did not last, and that they didn't have money to actually get more, and that's as high as 68% in Egypt, majority in Libya as well. But nearly half in an additional 2 countries, in Lebanon and in Jordan, are also reporting the same. And even if citizens did not actually run out of food, there's a concern that it would happen, and that is lurking among majorities in actually 9 out of the 10 countries where we surveyed, as low as 53% in Jordan to 74% in Palestine, that even if it didn't happen, the possibility was clearly there. And perhaps what's most alarming about these findings is that these countries, several of these countries actually depressed expectations. So when we look, for example, at both the World Bank country income classification or the Human Development Index score, which is a composite measure measuring life expectancy, access to education, and standard of living, that countries that are deemed either upper middle or lower middle income countries by the World Bank, or that have a high human development score, nonetheless have a significant portion of their population that are saying that they are suffering from food insecurity. So some of these countries notably are countries where conflict is ongoing, but in places like Jordan, for example, or Tunisia, that these high levels of kind of development are potentially masking kind of or obscuring the everyday lived realities of citizens. One of the areas where we see that food insecurity is really affecting preferences is in government types and in type of government preferences. So over the past decade, as we've been tracking this, the desire for or support for democracy has been in decline, but nonetheless, in wave 7, in 7 out of 10 countries, majorities still think that democracy is always the preferable form of government. Only small minorities think that a non-democratic government can be preferable. But what we are seeing is that the allegiance to democracy in theory is slightly lower among food insecure citizens, and this is particularly the case in Sudan and Morocco, where we see double-digit differences, and also in Egypt, Libya, and Iraq, which have smaller but nonetheless significant differences. At the same time, that we see that democracy is preferable, we also see that there is this desire to see results. And one of the ways that we see that are through these measures that are often used to detect more populist or strongman tendencies. And we see, interestingly, that in the 2 countries that have had probably the most meaningful experience with elections, Iraq and Tunisia, that this desire for having a country have a leader who can get things, who can bend the rules to get things done, is actually highest among this list. That said, those countries where the differences between food secure and insecure citizens are most poignant are actually at the bottom of this list, but they're nonetheless there. So specifically in Sudan, Jordan, Palestine, Morocco, and Mauritania, those who sometimes or often run out of food are significantly more likely than their food secure counterparts to kind of want this more strongman style leadership. So the issue here kind of in considering views of democracy and populism is that if we consider them independently, I think what would happen is that it would be a mistakenly affirming or rejecting kind of the broader freedom paradigm. But when we look at them together and we bring in this aspect of food insecurity, we're actually reinforcing the false dichotomy of the paradigm, right? That publics in these countries where we carried out the survey both want democracy and they want kind of say in the decision-making processes, but at the same time, they want systems that can provide for their basic needs. So what's also coming out here is that while food insecure citizens have their preferences for democracy over its alternatives is a little weaker than food secure citizens, and while they might want they might privilege kind of these outcomes over the process, overall there's no country where they outright reverse the trend, so that with few exceptions, where food insecure citizens are in the majority preferencing democracy, so too are food insecure citizens. Another one of the kind of key areas where food insecurity is kind of highlights a problem is in gender divides. And while they're not as prevalent as they are when we are talking about government preferences or Stark, they do exist, and they're particularly kind of differences between reports of food insecurity among men and women are particularly salient in Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, and Tunisia. Furthermore, those women who are self-identifying as divorced, widowed, or separated are significantly likelier than those who are single or engaged to report often or sometimes running out of food across all countries. And then married women, they're likelier to report the same than married women in Tunisia, Lebanon, Jordan, and Libya and Palestine. And I highlight this specific group in particular here because given social structures, this group of women, so divorced, widowed, or separated, can often be female-headed households, right? So there's kind of this additional vulnerability here. This marital status is kind of a proxy for that on our surveys. But the fact that they are reporting food insecurity at a much higher rate is quite alarming, particularly when put in kind of context with the labor market. The shares to be kind of sure across the board, those who have access to personal income, right, not gender disaggregated, are less likely to say that they encountered food insecurity, which makes sense. But what's particularly interesting here is that when we divide out kind of women who have access to personal income, which is again proxied by those who self-reported as employed, self-employed, or retired with a pension. So something that measures that they have a stream of income. What's interesting is that there are divides among both men and women, but the divides among women are much larger than there are among men. So if we look just at the differential, for example, in Tunisia, women who don't have access to personal income are 28 percentage points more likely to report food insecurity in comparison to men, where they're 13%. Those who don't have access to personal income are 13% more likely to report food insecurity. In Jordan, there's even a larger difference, 21% points between employed or women that have access to income and don't, versus a 5-point gap between men who have access to income and don't. And so for the past 20 years, the MENA region has been one where the labor force participation has actually been lowest than all other regions of the world. And so kind of this food insecurity dynamic reiterates one of the consequences of kind of that disparity. A third issue kind of that we looked at with respect to food insecurity and or one that really food insecurity brings to the forefront is climate change. Of course, pollution, desertification, drought, floods, increasing salinity have all affected surveyed countries by affecting the agricultural sector, which of course then affects kind of one element of food security, which is the availability of food. And despite kind of those documented changes of the effects of climate change on agriculture and thus food availability, the desire for governments to do more about climate change is actually at best lukewarm. So a majority in Tunisia, a strong majority in Tunisia, and that's really the only country where we see that 64% of citizens say that the national government should be doing more to address climate change. In Mauritania and Egypt, it's just over half. In Iraq and Lebanon, it's just under half. But what is really interesting is that despite those documented changes, food insecure citizens are actually much less likely to want government intervention on these issues. So those gaps are pretty extreme in Lebanon, where it's 25-point difference between food secure and insecure citizens. In Sudan, where we have a 17-point gap, and then in Egypt and Morocco, where we have 16 and 15-point gaps respectively. But this doesn't actually seem like it's related to an awareness issue. And part of what is suggesting that is kind of comparing these people's levels of education. So in all countries except for Libya, those reporting food insufficiency are much less likely to have a higher level of education, right? They're much more likely to have at max a secondary education. But the desire to see kind of increased intervention into climate change does not actually vary in all the same countries or by the same extent. So one of the examples that you can look at here, for example, is Jordan. So in Jordan, there's a 25-point gap in food insufficiency between those who have max secondary and max higher education. But when we look at whether or not kind of the desire to see more action on climate change varies by education, we see that it actually doesn't at all, right? 39 and 40%, there is no statistically significant difference there. So this suggests that that level of education alone is not actually explaining away the differences in climate action between those who have and have not explained food insecurity. Instead, it seems that publics really are signaling that they want the efforts of their government to be redirected elsewhere into issues that are kind of more proximate. And one of those places, of course, is the economy. In all countries except for Libya and Iraq in Wave 7, pluralities. In Jordan, it's an outright majority, and in Lebanon and Iraq, it's almost Lebanon and Egypt, it's almost half who say that the economic situation is the most important one facing the country. The spread of coronavirus is still looming heavily on Egyptians. And instability, of course, is still posing a problem in Libya and Sudan, but still kind of the economy is really the main thing on people's minds in terms of the biggest problems. Yet, except there actually isn't much difference between those who are and are not food insecure with respect to this. The only places where kind of these differences pop are in Palestine, Mauritania, and Iraq, and to some extent. And that, I think that just has to do with the fact that the overall assessments of the economic situation in the country aren't great. So really minorities, at most a third in, say, Morocco, Mauritania, and Palestine, say that the economic situation is doing good or very good, down to less than 1% in Lebanon. Again, here, the evaluations of the economic situation do vary according to food insecurity, which with people who are saying that they often or sometimes run out of food, being more likely to suggest that the economic situation, or being less likely to suggest that the economic situation is good or very good. But again, there are some countries where we have double-digit differences, but not kind of across the board. And when it comes to asking, well, how do we want this addressed? There are kind of two key pieces that most citizens suggest they want a government intervention on. The first is creating jobs, and that's particularly the case in Iraq, where again there's an outright majority that says that the best or the most important way that the government can improve economic conditions is actually to provide jobs. It's the share is equally or rather high as well in both Palestine and Egypt, and in Jordan, where again, these are kind of strong pluralities. But limiting inflation is also a key piece of this. And of course, inflation has a key place where inflation has been quite rampant for the past year or so, is on food insecurity. Yet again, there are moderate at best kind of differences between those who are and are not food secure in terms of what the government should be doing. So kind of in Egypt in particular, for example, we were in the field in Egypt in January, and January 2022, I think, recorded quite a high increase in the cost of food. So we see kind of that difference being reflected in differences for among those who sometimes are often ran out of food, wanting the government really wanting to focus on limiting inflation. But again, otherwise the differences are a little bit muted. I'll end kind of with one piece that as a bit of a coda, because it seems like it's in the kind of the background. It isn't as much discussed anymore, particularly since supply chain issues war in Ukraine has taken kind of center stage. But of course, kind of food insecurity, before the war in Ukraine began, food insecurity really had to do and was affected kind of by the COVID-19 pandemic. And when we asked what the biggest challenge was that COVID caused, I mean, one of the biggest issues that came up was inflation. 40% in Egypt, 23% in Jordan, 30% in Iraq, and 35% of people in Tunisia really said that the inflation was the biggest kind of consequence. Closely thereafter is a lack of income. Or a loss of income, of course, that COVID caused, which again would affect people's access to food, and scarcity. But what's interesting when we kind of look at this kind of host of potential of the causes of the challenges caused by COVID, there's quite a lot of variation. And we kind of, if we group them into two pieces, right, into kind of economic challenges, which you could here say are kind of inflation, scarcity, and lack of income, versus all of these other challenges, things like getting COVID or the psychological effects, or disruption of education, social life, right? These more social or kind of service related challenges, we actually start to see that there's a split, right? It's only in kind of 5 countries, in Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Mauritania, and Tunisia, where kind of these grouped economic challenges are really the key ones that are being caused by COVID, versus in some of these other in the remaining 5 countries, it's a conflation of all these other pieces. And with respect to those who have kind of encountered food insecurity, it's not actually, again, the economic differences here are muted. So that, those who are saying that it's the biggest challenge caused by COVID is inflation, or the biggest challenge is loss of income, those who are food insecure are not summarily across the board, or even in significant margins, saying that those are the main problems in comparison to the food secured counterparts. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Karen, to discuss this a little more. Thanks.
It's fantastic. Thank you, Sama, for such a great presentation and just for doing this work. I just want to draw out a few things that have stood out to me just in reading the report and hearing your presentation, and then we'll get to Hafsa and Michael. I think the timing of this survey is really interesting, and that it predates much of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so I know Michael's been working on the idea of food security. It's been brewing, right? This isn't a new issue, but it's really now, I think, snowballing. And so I think in your next year survey, you're going to see probably these early findings intensified. The other thing that's interesting to me is that, these links to inflation and, the proportion of what people spend generally across the MENA region, with real exceptions in the Gulf, is that food is a very large part of the consumer basket in the Middle East, right? And so the way that people feel inflation comes first really in terms of family spending on what you eat, what you're putting on your table. And that's a little different than in other places where we have this global inflationary pressure. Energy security is being more heightened, and what people feel, especially in rich countries, which leads me to the third thing that really stood out to me in your finding is that despite high development indicators really across the region, these are low, middle, or even middle income countries, this high food insecurity. So again, not a new problem across the Middle East, something that has animated politics for over a decade now, but something that structurally has not been solved, right? So what is that mismatch? And I know Hafsa might have something to say about that as well. And then fourth and last, the finding that you, or not your finding, but one that is really coming out in the literature now, is that extreme poverty has increased in the Middle East and North Africa in the last 5-6 years, and not really in other places in the world. So why is that? And what is this sort of widening gap even among the poor or not so poor? So again, just congratulations on the report, really fantastic. And I'm eager to hear what analysts Hafsa Halawa and Michael Tantum have to say about it, because I know they're following these issues very closely. Maybe we'll go to Hafsa first. I know you work a lot on gender issues, but tell us what stood out to you and what you're watching now.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for the invitation to join everyone. And thank you so much, Salma, not just for the presentation, but the entire report and all of the, for me, what's so useful about this report is how much it ties into every aspect of our work, whether you're working on the economic agenda, more development, governance issues like I am, and how useful it is to both confirm your analysis or confirm the work that we're doing and the policy recommendations we're making, but also just hypotheses as well about the trajectory for these countries. For me, piggybacking on Karen's comments about predating, there's been this we've had 6 months from most countries in the region of this rhetoric of how much Ukraine is affecting and putting pressure on the economies and on the ability of the state to respond to this global crisis. And for me, yes, I think in a year's time it will be worse, but how bad it already is on this level is indicative of bad governance and policy across the board, and really kind of to tease out how we got to this stage. What is it about the policies in the countries? Is there similar policies that are having similar effects? Just a couple of comments. They're all a bit jumbled up. I read the report and jotted as I wrote, so apologies for jumping. And I want to speak in the essence of saving some time. But one question I have for you, Selma, is in relation to the government response and also the democracy indicators. Were the questions, or are the questions in terms of the data you collected, in terms of a comparative response? People would rather see the government intervene on economic issues, or are we talking more about trust deficits that are growing, that have been growing, certainly on social protection issues and things over the years, particularly transparency, accountability? Is that also reflecting in the results that we've seen from you today? And in that vein, I think the results from Iraq are so telling, because where you have the smallest gap between those who are food insecure and not regarding the democracy indicators in the crisis that we've been in for the last 2 years, where they really want change in government and change in the governance system itself with service delivery and otherwise, it's the lowest participation rate of women in the labor force. And at the same time, we've seen corruption on such a large scale and such a massive lack of physical security and protection, particularly for women across the country. And it breaches the Erbil-Baghdad divide, liberated areas post-war. Basra produces the most oil, is the most impoverished province in the country. And really, for me, how we can use these results to better inform our gender work and policy that leads us to talk about protection, social protection, physical protection, legal protection of women, to allow them the physical security to access the labor market, which is a major barrier that hampers women across the region, which I find the Libya result in that regard quite interesting, because they were the most in employment or registered as employed despite the conflict indicators there. And just a last question on the last point, on the issue of the food security and demographics. Egypt and Sudan, by my calculations, and please correct me if I'm wrong, speakers, people watching, accounts for something around the 32% population of the entire region as a whole. The politics and the geopolitics around Sudan, the holy grail breadbasket, as it's referred to, the under the table land grabbing interventions and policies that are about securing other nations access to food, agriculture, when it is both one of the fastest growing populations, it is the youngest population in the region, and it is now both one of the most politically insecure regions. These food insecurity numbers are further proof of the instability that will continue to plague a country like Sudan without a governance structure, not to debate what that should be, whilst we have all these foreign interventions. And with Egypt, I want to ask you, Salma, how much in the years you've been doing this work, how much the population increase and the pressure of that is having on these numbers, or are they correlating the same over the years with the acceleration, the slight pause we had in population growth, or is there some particular analysis we can tease out of that? Thank you so much, Karen.
Well, Hafsa has given us some tough questions, Salma. I don't know if you want to respond now. Maybe we should let you do a quick response and then maybe take some more time. I don't know if you can respond on that last point on the kind of data comparison, and then we'll go to Michael.
Yeah, these are actually great. And you know, one of the you know, I hope it's not just me who's going to work on these questions. I mean, the purpose of kind of putting it, making this data publicly available is exactly for this, because people who will have much more in-depth knowledge than I on some of the specifics, it would actually be great to hear from them. But to kind of to respond to a few things. So with respect to kind of, you started by asking about the kind of the comparative response. So the democracy indicators, we actually have two sets. One of which is the one that I showed, which is comparative, right? Which is of all the, you know, of these, what do you want? And that's where we really see people saying that we want democracy. And that's really important to keep in mind when you look at kind of the other set that asks them about the performance of democracy, performance on the economy, performance on stability, where people are, that's where you see kind of they're losing faith. But my colleague Michael Robbins kind of wrote about this and has cited research on the fact that when people have a sobering view of democracy, that is, that democracy won't solve every pothole in the country, that it is more likely to succeed, right? And so to tie in kind of the food insecurity piece here, that in the countries where you are having people who are food insecure kind of driving that, you know, they still prefer it, but they prefer it at a lower rate. If you can kind of solve that piece, there's, you know, there's evidence that if you close that gap, the overall kind of reaffirming commitment to democracy will rise again. So that's how those kind of questions are set out. The populism questions are new for us. So we're starting kind of to try and understand, you know, this at one point, honestly, especially in 2019, when we kind of got the moment of, you know, before the pandemic, the protests in Lebanon and Iraq were suggesting a kind of Arab Spring 2.0, right? That was completely interrupted. But so the question at that point was, is there a nostalgia for this kind of Nasserism style government where these kind of trials to democracy really had not necessarily produced the outcomes that people wanted. So we introduced the questions at that point, and this is the first time that we've actually gotten to ask them face to face. And again, those are kind of, they're not comparative indicators. It's not putting kind of like an elected official versus a strong man who can bend the rules. That's a really interesting idea. But that's kind of why, again, looking at these kind of things in tandem to see the full picture, I think is key to kind of understanding the dynamic that is going on. Because I think what we're seeing more than anything on the populism question is kind of the flip side of the coin of the kind of outcomes of democracy question, which are people want outcomes. They want their basic needs met. And that's kind of what they're pushing for in that. With respect to Iraq, I mean, you know, I should say, and I mentioned this in the report, but I think it's important to keep in mind that of the countries that we have actually included, and actually in the region of the whole, there's not a single country that in the past 10 years has been unscathed by either kind of violent conflict, right? Interventions, coups, massive refugee and IDP crises. In fact, it is the country that is, it is the region to date that is host to most refugees and IDPs in the world. Iraq in particular is a big, it is a key place. As late as 2018, 1 in 10 Iraqis was an IDP. Right. Among the IDP population, because Hafsa, you also mentioned women, right? That kind of access to jobs in female-headed households. Of course, with the 20+ years of conflict, we've gotten a really kind of distorted age and gender pyramid, where we have a lot of older women who are now don't are not married and are not in the labor force. That creates a kind of a big kind of lopsided pyramid. And to answer actually your question, I will plug next week my colleagues Mary Claire Roche and the PI on the study, Dr. Amani Jamal, will actually be giving a full presentation on gender, and we specifically ask questions about what are the barriers to women's entry into the workforce, and we have some really interesting results there, both in terms of what are they for women, what are they for men, and which are bigger ones for men versus women. So that'll be a really interesting one to kind of dig into. And then finally, with respect to Egypt and the population numbers and Sudan and this kind of, what does it mean when the world's breadbasket can't feed itself? That's that is terrifying. I think that so this food insecurity question is also, this is the first year that we've asked it in our face-to-face surveys. We did ask it in 2020 on the phone in the midst of kind of the COVID-19 pandemic, but this is the first time we've asked it face-to-face. So my only kind of answer to that would be stay tuned to kind of see what's going to happen. We do have kind of trends as kind of corruption, in both of these countries. The extent to which corruption is there is astronomical. The extent to which people are perceive that the government is doing something about corruption is in ad hoc fluctuating. But the extent to which kind of this food insecurity piece is going to continue to put pressure on governments is hopefully something we can continue to kind of look at in future waves.
Thank you, Salma. That's fantastic. Really good responses and something to look forward to. I can't wait to hear more on these sort of gender dynamics from this result. I also want to encourage the audience, please use the Q&A function if you'd like to get a question in. We do have plenty of time still. I want to go to Michael Tanchum yet for his next for his reactions on the report, maybe some insights. Michael, I know you've been studying the issue of food security and sort of general supply chains across MENA and North African economies. What stood out to you, and what I think the big question to me for you is, what do you see coming next? Right. If things are going to get worse, if these are the early indications of where we are now, what does this kind of project for us into the next year?
Thank you, Karen. And Salma, again, congratulations on this fine report. Picking up on the comments before, I see this as a very valuable baseline because some of this data was taken before Russia, Ukraine. Also, when people were just starting to feel the food crisis. And so I want to explain that. The Middle East was in a food crisis as early as the summer 2021. On June 3rd, 2021, food inflation reached the same level as the immediate buildup to the Arab Spring a decade earlier. So we were already there. By the time we got to November, whereas MEI has been following this, we had published a very groundbreaking report on this in November 2021, one of the first identifying the food crisis. Let me give you an example. Soft wheat, which is what's used to make bread. Bread is symbolic. So it's something about this. I would ask specific food items. Bread is like a social contract in the Middle East, right? The slogan is bread, dignity, and social justice, right? The iconic pictures of esh baladi, little kids holding up esh baladi or baguettes if they're in Tunisia. So bread. The other specific item I would ask is cooking oil. But soft wheat, in Q3, the third quarter 2021, was at $271 per ton. That already was a 22% increase over the previous year. So we were already in a food crisis. So my point here is 2021, there was a crisis. 2022, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine on 24 February, it accelerated. 2023, it is going to be massively intensified, even at the end of 2022. So getting back to that, so March 1st, 2022, a week after the invasion, the price went from $271 a ton to $348 a ton. So you see the increase. And that's very convenient because the price of wheat today is the same as it was on March 1st. So we have not gone down to pre-crisis levels. There is not going to be an end to this crisis. And in fact, even if Russia and Ukraine made peace today, we would have an extremely severe crisis anyhow, for reasons I can explain, mostly having to do with the lack of fertilizer and affordable fertilizer. So, which brings me to this next point. In 2021, gas was up 400%, which meant that ammonia was up $1,000 compared to $100 the previous year, which meant fertilizer was the highest price in 10 years. But these don't get felt until the next season. So we're coming up to the next harvest season when that food is going to be on the table. So that's where we're going to feel it. So there are three countries I worry about that I wanted to mention to you. And then I also want to mention Morocco, which I don't worry about, but there were interesting elements in the report. Now, Egypt, 105 million people. Egypt already spends, at the price in 2021, they spent $3.3 billion on subsidies for bread alone, 3.3 billion. At the price it is now, which was the same price a week after the invasion, it would cost 5 billion for those subsidies. So Salma, one of the questions I would ask is subsidies, government subsidies, because my reading of things, which correlates with your report, it's not democracy or non-democracy, it's effective governance. And by saying effective, I don't mean good governance. I don't mean government accountability or transparent institutions. Can they get the food on the table, the cooking oil in the stores? You know, when Egypt kept the same price for cooking oil, but reduced the bottle by a third, what do people think about that? But Egypt's was effective. So you remember Omicron, which the crisis that never happened. So when people were thinking the global economy would be locked down, and what happened was the price of wheat dipped in November. Egypt, GASC, very smartly bought 600,000 tons of wheat during that price dip, got bargain basement price, and so they've been effective. The things that are structural is getting off of food imports and getting off of subsidies, which means increasing agriculture, which in Egypt's case means water. So the other issues, and this will come up with Tunisia, is when you ask about food, I would ask about water, because Egypt, of course, in the region has the smallest amount of rainfall, 33.3 millimeters per year. Compare that to Morocco, which has 5 times the amount. And 80% goes to agriculture across the MENA region. So there will be no solution unless you have desalination. You need better dams, better irrigation, and then ultimately desalination, which is ultimately an energy issue. So, and in the short term, you're not going to be able to do that with renewables. At MEI, we've written a lot about Egypt's natural gas. In Egypt, we published a report on renewables and green hydrogen. But in the short term, that's going to take natural gas. So on the Egypt side, I think I've been less worried because the government has been effective. And it would be interesting to see how that is reflected in public opinion. And I think President Sisi taking personal responsibility often was a very interesting move. Tunisia is the opposite case. Tunisia and Lebanon are the two countries I worry the most about. So the FAO does a rolling 3-year average. So in 2014 to 2016, you had 18% of the population was food insecure, moderate to severe. By 2018 to 2020, that jumped to 25%. So already we see it. Tunisia already needed 50% of cereal grains. Cereal grains is a big issue for human consumption, and then 60% for livestock, which is poultry. So there's going to be a big MENA poultry crisis in 2023. this is something else to think about, but now with Tunisia, it's 70% they're going to need for grains in general, 90% imports. So, and again, they have the subsidy issue. And the only way in the short term they survive is by getting money. Again, the fertilizer is an issue. Tunisia can only satisfy 25% of its needs. So it's going to take huge capital investments to solve the problems, either creating food in the countries or close enough nearby. So, but with Tunisia, again, if on the water issue, right, the dams are silted up. There is no water. Sometimes to get from the reservoir to the tap in a kitchen in Tunis, up to 50% of the water is lost. So this is just bad governance. There's bad management of the water resources, bad management of fertilizer. And so this is where I think kind of honing in on those questions would be important. Lebanon is the other country I worry about. Food inflation since 2019 is 1,000% now. Bread is almost unavailable, but of course the symbolic thing, it was the grain silos in Beirut, which was 3 months worth of storage, was suddenly blown up in 2020, never repaired. And then of course, on the anniversary, more of it collapsed. And what we have now is a crisis. And that's where I found the issue of the future very important, because you did a previous study, Arab Barometer, I believe, saying 48% of Lebanese want to emigrate. And among people with college degrees in that previous report, it's up to 61. Now that is driven by food. For young people, 2021 baby formula, infant formula was up 700%. Now, for those people, you live in Europe or America, you buy the kind of infant formula in a container about this size. That costs equivalent of $66 in Lebanon, one container. So what you have is 1 in 5 doctors in Lebanon have left or planning to leave, and engineers. So these kinds of questions and tying it to food, especially in Lebanon and the economic situation, and then again, the government's ability to do, because the consequence of those storage not being rebuilt is there's no grain goes to Beirut anymore. It goes to Tripoli, and there's only 1 month's worth of storage, right? Through using warehouses in Tripoli from flour mills. So Lebanon was on a 1 month cycle every month to refill. And the only way they could do that is from Ukraine, because it's only a week's journey to the Black Sea. Even if you could get grain from America, it would take a minimum of 25 days. So those kind of basic governance problems, I think, are really important. And then the Morocco data I found was very interesting, because as you said in your report, Morocco has had a lot of intentionality about this. And with the issue of agriculture, Morocco also is unusual because it is the country with the largest percentage of its population engaged in agriculture. So Morocco has taken the approach, you mentioned the Green Morocco Plan, Plan Maroc Vert, which was successful, although it had problems. And now there's a successor plan for the 2030 green generation. But their idea is to create value-added production to move these people in the middle class. I think what I've picked up and what your report shows, these labels of middle income, upper middle income, lower middle income, really are misnomers. People are not, these countries are called middle income countries, but the people are not in the middle class. And it's, as you pointed out, is shrinking. So I think also the issue with Morocco is geography. And a lot of these things, obviously, Morocco has been very smart. Morocco is a rising power economically, and now they're trying to spread out the concentration of new jobs and wealth. So Morocco makes a tremendous amount of money now outsourcing engineering services. Europe, America, they outsource engineering and business process services. But now Morocco created 5 centers, and they put them in more outlying areas. So Oujda, for example, if you know the geography of Morocco, near the Algerian border. So what I would say too is, even within these countries, you have the urban-rural divide, which I think is very important. But this kind of geography of periphery versus the metropole, I think would also be useful. So again, I congratulate you, and I would ask to continue this, because I think we're going to see a very intense development over the next couple of years.
Thank you, Michael. Well, they certainly will continue, and we all are relying now on the Barometer project, and have for many years, for their excellent work. But as Salma said, it's not just up to them, right? And so I think what has animated social scientists and economists about this surveys is that it helps us see this bigger picture, and particularly the interconnections, this triangle between food security, energy security, and governance. And it's really highlighted in the findings. We've got some questions coming in to the Q&A, so I certainly would welcome any more. But Salma, if you'd like to respond to any of the points that Michael made, we could do that first, and then I'll take these questions we're seeing.
Great, thanks. So yeah, Michael, our data actually already bear you out on subsidies. So we actually specifically ask about what should be the top government spending priority in the coming year. And the options are education, healthcare, reducing pollution, improving roads, national security subsidies, fighting terrorism, the Beirut port explosion for Lebanon, or other things. And I will tell you that in Jordan and Lebanon, respectively, 45% and 50% say the top government spending issue should be subsidies. Followed by 31% in Mauritania and 27% in Morocco. The other kind of key thing, actually, in the wake of COVID, still is the healthcare system, which is mainly the issue in Palestine and Morocco, though again, Morocco is kind of split. So you're absolutely right, is that these are kind of this is what people are crying out for right now. I wonder, and I guess I would kind of ask you in return, to what extent those, are those, is that kind of stopgap measure what got us here in the first place, right? That clearly, one of the things that struck me as I was kind of reading the literature on this is that there are some sources that are really starting to kind of put these in time horizon baskets, right? There's the immediate term, there's the medium term, and the kind of the long-term solution. So something like climate change is medium long-term, right? Where eventually, and I will say with respect to water, so my colleague Mohammed Abu Falagan and I are working on this climate change report. He will be back, I think, in 2 weeks to kind of present those findings. And I will say that, kind of teasing that as well, that the number one issue that anyone across the region suggests is the number one environmental problem has to do with water, either the availability of drinking water, pollution, or kind of the pollution of waterways, or even the so the availability of water. I think in Jordan, the cost of actually water in the past year alone has skyrocketed. It's really an asset. It's triple digit kind of increases. So again, our data also kind of have started to bear you out on that, in that people are aware that water is the problem. I think part of the issue with the climate changes piece is kind of reframing climate change as more immediate than people think. Right, that because people feel on their table that, like, okay, there's no water or there's no bread, right? But that climate change is a little bit removed from that. So I wonder, to what extent, yeah, people want subsidies, and that's really great in the short term, but is that kind of catching us in this trap of not actually solving the problem kind of long term? But yeah, I think. Given kind of how this is kind of food is really a nexus, and as you said, it's bread, dignity, social justice, right? It's really it's part of the social contract. My colleague Jose Ciro Martinez has really written about this in Jordan, about how like it's a part of participation. So we can certainly in the future, I think it would be interesting to kind of expand what parts of the food insecurity piece are going to be affecting people most, or what they perceive it, right, to be affecting most. Because again, people's perceptions are different from what the actual reality might be. But even kind of identifying a gap, which is actually also where this type of survey data is useful, right? If people perceive that the water issue is the most problematic, it's not necessarily the case that it is. It often is, but it's not necessarily the case. But if people's perceptions are different from kind of other independent measures of kind of these structural phenomena, you see there's an awareness gap, and at least it's an inroads of how you actually start to treat a problem. So that's something that we will certainly kind of look into in the future.
This just is so exciting as a political economist, because it all goes back to this question of, oh, the fix is more subsidies, but the fiscal space is obviously closing. We know that it's going to be harder for governments to access credit lines. It just all kind of goes back to this question of service delivery of governance, but also what citizens understand as the possibilities and what they see as their contribution also in that process. So in terms of a little bit of the definitions, which gets to one of the questions we have right now, the only question we have in the Q&A is about this issue of defining democratic governance. So it's a little bit within your survey, I guess, how you handle your questions, and in different places, what are that sliding scale, and where do respondents define themselves on a scale? Is that something that you engage with them, or is it just like, here's the question, answer the way you want?
Yeah, so thanks. That's a great question. So we actually have done this in the past. It was not on this survey. We're moving into 300 questions is a long survey. It takes a good 45 to 60 minutes, and keeping someone's attention for that long on this diverse issues is a challenge, and also a testament to our local kind of regional teams and their ability to do this. But in wave 5, we did used to ask on a scale of 1 to 10, how democratic do you think you are? And then we did previously ask kind of, what do you mean by democracy? So we do have that historically. It was for space considerations removed from wave 7. We can certainly bring it back in the future, but some of the things that we have inferred, and I think it also goes to Michael's point about effective governance, right? People want to see outcomes, and that's really how they're judging, right? It's not about kind of it's little d democracy, right? The things that give you outputs right now, rather than kind of these big theoretical questions. So I would encourage you to actually, you can look at that on our wave 5 surveys that were done 2018 to 2019, so they're not too old. But again, those questions go on and off our survey, so we could certainly kind of bring those back, because this is actually something else that has come up now as of all right, so what are people thinking of as democracy? And again, it's especially interesting in light of the fact that the countries that have had successive changes of government via elections, which is a procedural kind of minimum, are also the countries where we see highest support for the measures of populism. So we can potentially bring that back.
There's another question that's come in and kind of related to methodology also. How do we define food insecurity? What does that mean? And is that
Sure.
different than how other surveys use it?
Yeah. So okay. So hunger and food insecurity are two separate things. We specifically ask, and that's a great question. What I've been kind of shorthanding as food insecurity is this question. We ask to what extent, how often does the following happen? We ran out of food before we had money to buy more, right? And so when you look at the FAO definition of kind of hunger, right? Hunger is malnutrition based. It's a caloric thing. But FAO is also suggesting that this needs to be expanded to food insecurity, which the definition of which includes access to food because of availability issues or because of resources, right? The fact that you don't have the resources to buy the food that you need is problematic. So that is how we are taking it in our report. The other thing I would methodologically kind of be careful of when you're comparing different surveys. Our survey is of individuals, right? We ask, it's the population of nationals who are reporting this. Other surveys of food insecurity do it by households, right? So they're you know, that's also kind of something to take into account. We haven't really, and again, this is the first time that we've asked this, so we will be in a face-to-face environment. So it is something that we will be kind of tracking over time. But you know, the FAO, the 2019 report, and then the more recent 2021 report or 2020 report will kind of have different exact numbers or percentages. And I talk about this in the report because it's that 2019 report really sounded alarm bells, and I think as Michael mentioned, that even, you know, by summer 2021, we were there already. We weren't waiting for the war in Ukraine. We're kind of, you know, after COVID, we were at 1 in 3 were food insecure by their measures.
And I imagine that the way that you're asking and differentiating among gender, when you ask women specifically, you know, women know what's in the cupboard. You know, one of the definitions of feminism is not knowing when you run out of milk, right? Letting it be someone else's problem. But in most of the Middle East, it is a woman's problem to know. So, you know, how do you see that kind of changing the definition, but also changing the kind of data that you're getting?
So this was a part of, you know, full disclosure, I played a lot around with this issue and kind of reputational aspects as well, of like the flip side of that being kind of, you know, maybe men don't want to be as forthcoming with saying that there's not enough money for food because it reflects on them as a provider. But so this was also one thing we entertained when I first saw these differences on men and women, that you know, especially in the places where we saw it, because as you saw in the report, in Jordan and Iraq, we have the highest number of women who self-identify as housewives, and traditionally kind of the kitchen falls under the you know, her purview of her domain, and so she would know best kind of what is coming in and out, or she would know best on how to make do, right? That the rest of the family might not necessarily notice that the amount of chicken or the amount of beef or the, you know, the type of food, because she's gotten creative. And so part of it is that, you know, she has more immediate knowledge. That could be kind of one piece of it, and it does align with the kind of the ratio of housewives to employed women. Piece of it. And then the other piece, kind of the counter side of could like men not be reporting or be hesitant to report, having to do with kind of the reputational consequences. But these are all, you know, this is kind of, these are preliminary hypotheses that if people actually see the need for, you know, I always entertain questions to be added. I'm always interested in looking for kind of what are kind of the new places where we need to be doing deep dives when we get onto these kind of modules. So these types of questions, I think that can be useful to broad audiences. We're always looking to kind of build them into the survey.
I wanted to bring Hafsa. Do you have anything else? Any other questions that have come to mind for you?
It's not really questions. I think I want to stir the pot a little bit. This kind of, and not to challenge any of the findings, but this question of effective governance, good governance, little d democracy. I find it, you know, I think for us, when we're looking at the indicators for the region, obviously on the bigger scale, we're looking at questions of sustainability. How sustainable is this system? How sustainable are these models? Quality of life for people and stability, because we are coming out of a decade where we've had uprisings and conflict. And now that is the, you know, whether you're a foreign policy expert or whether you're looking at the policies in the countries that we're looking in the region, you're constantly looking at, you know, what are or aren't triggers that might instigate. And I've always been struck with every wave, and as we're talking now, Iran in its throes of whatever might happen there, food insecurity, economic concerns, they are sort of pressures that are absorbed to a level, not all the way, and I hate the word resilience, but there is a level of absorbing economic stress. And then the trigger is always something incredibly social. It is about women or violence or brutality, and ultimately it comes down to a lack of accountability. And what we're talking about ultimately is, I think, and I don't see that these results change that hypothesis or change that analysis, is a need to look at governance in the region, be it autocratic or democracy, and look at ways in which we can increase transparency and accountability. Anecdotally, and I'm in Dubai now, but I've been in Egypt for the better part of 16 years. Anecdotally, in the last 6 to 8 months in Egypt, the biggest question is, when is the devaluation happening? Everyone knows it's coming. Everyone knows it has to come. Whoever you speak to, and this is not about elites or educated or otherwise, but everyone's just sitting there. There's no accountability. The central bank can decide on a whim whether it increases interest rates or doesn't. It doesn't even stick to the rate day. We've reached that point earlier this year. And so everyone's waiting for a policy they know will happen and they keep being told won't happen. So, this ultimately, it's not necessarily a question of food insecurity, but broader governance requires a level of transparency and communication and acceptance of the people as part of the calculation. In Iraq, we're now coming to the 12th month with no budget because we can't form a government, because the Iraqi political space is so toxic, paralyzed, and stagnant that government service delivery is in itself now coming to a halt, which was something for several years we only really saw in the conflict zones. So I think that it is for me, as Michael correctly said, the baseline, but it's indicative of how much governance is eroding in this region, where the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability is tipping the scales on whether we're talking about a future that can be stabilized or unsustainability of a scale that we don't know what that might lead to. And that's my greatest fear, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you're both all welcome to react to Hafsa's point. I think we're all kind of leaning in the same direction, that we expect more pressure, more fiscal pressure, more difficulty in sort of meeting needs, and in getting back to, the kind of structural problems in many MENA economies, which relied on subsidies, relied on kind of a false accounting system in some ways of what governments can provide, and then what's really doable going forward. Michael, Salma, anybody want to weigh into that? Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, what I think would be interesting is the intra-MENA relationships in this mix, Hafsa. If we look at Egypt, let's just take the food sector, for example, we see the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia heavily investing in the fertilizer sector, heavily investing in food sector. I mean, the Gulf policy on food itself is very interesting in what they're trying to do, first of all, across the world. Morocco, for example, again, Morocco is the 4th largest fertilizer producer in the world. Morocco has changed the policy of 20 some odd countries in Africa towards the Sahara region by helping them increase their food yields through fertilizer. They're building fertilizer factory in Nigeria, fertilizer factory in Ghana to service West Africa, fertilizer factory in Ethiopia, East Africa. So what I think we're going to see is they're the rich and the poor, the effective governance and the non-effective, and the relative balance of power between these players and how they intervene regionally is going to change. And when we're talking about these structural issues, because you cannot just keep kicking the can down the road, is going to reach a crisis proportion. How are these other players going to intervene? And I didn't mention Lebanon, which we could talk about Lebanon, and then of course Syria as well, in the terrible war situation, and especially with Russia not having enough bandwidth to deal with Syria. That raises who's going to go in? Turkey, the Gulf states, Egypt. So I think we're going to see a very interesting reshifting that these economics are going to help enable.
Thanks, Michael. I think that's a great point, the kind of dynamics within the region. And I've written a book about Gulf financial aid and intervention, so I certainly think that's important. It gets a little away from Salma's report and the kind of scope of her work and Arab Barometer. But I think it's absolutely essential in sort of a forward look of where we think things will be a year from now. And the resources that states have to meet some of these food demands.
That's why some I might wonder if in one country, let's say if you're interviewing in Tunisia, maybe you would ask which Arab country do people in Tunisia think is a model to follow?
Yeah.
Or which countries do they think should be providing help? I think this could also have interesting results.
Yeah, we could certainly bring those back. We actually used to ask something very similar, right?
Yeah. Also on the climate issue, the MENA region, except for the Gulf and maybe Egypt, doesn't contribute to climate change compared to Europe, China, Southeast Asia burning coal.
Well, Michael, you have to save that one for the climate report.
Yeah, but what I'm asking is,
now.
when you phrase it climate, I think you should phrase it more as being a good steward of the national resources. Right?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. So that could kind of that's certainly language experiments that we could start to do. I mean, we can okay, so a couple of things kind of here. Hassan, in response to your original point, I think what we've tried to do increasingly to kind of get at this on the survey is that we now know what people in the MENA region don't want. So what do they want? Right? So a lot of our questions in that vein have started to ask for people for their preference on what should the government be doing, right? Regardless of whether or not in their internal systems they have a way of expressing that, right? So kind of this adjunct way of getting it, and I think that's the that is kind of the limit of kind of survey research. Once you get somebody's preference on how to do something, actually getting there, I think, involves a lot of other actors. So they can tell us what they want. The extent to which somebody can express, what is the best way forward, that gets to be, I think, we could certainly ask, but it runs into the same problem, I think, Michael, with when we start to go into these specifics, and we see this to be honest, methodologically on our international relations sections, it has the highest number of don't knows throughout, right? People don't necessarily have an opinion of X country or Y country. People don't know enough about the partnership, of this kind of trade agreement or that kind of intra cooperation zone to actually have an opinion on it. So kind of the difficulties that we run in there from the methodological place is really starting to measure non-opinions. There are kind of some ways around this in terms of giving the idea. We could do kind of types of vignettes, but kind of asking the question head on more often than not is going to give me I don't know, or I refuse to answer rate of over 25%, which always makes me think, well, what are the people who are responding to? Certainly kind of the interregional relationships, we've started to we gauge what those are, or at least what people's opinions are. My colleague Mary Claire Roche just wrote a blog that is up, I think, on our website about perceptions of regional leaders, right, as a kind of a proxy to kind of what you're starting to think about. If you think that Mohammed bin Salman has a vision, right, like it or not, right, but that he has a vision versus Erdogan versus Mohammed bin Zayed, so that we can start to kind of approximate that. Or kind of the other way that we could potentially move forward is, again, and this goes back to I think the first person who asked a question about how do you ask these? Are they in comparison to each other or separately, right? That when you ask them on a certain set, which one do you want to be most like, or which one do you like the most out of this, is a little bit different from kind of asking individually, how would you gauge each of these. So these are all great ideas and suggestions for kind of how we can do this in the future. And of course, the more the data gets used, and the more kind of these ideas come up, the better it is for us, because we can kind of incorporate this into the survey.
Selma, I want to sort of close with a question on just policy within Barometer and your team. I mean, how do you want these results used? What is your aspiration for policy, for academics? I mean, what, you just want to put it out into the world and see what happens, or what's the level of engagement that you would like to see?
That's a great question. Thanks very much for that. Data depends on the user, and it's out there for everybody to use as best they see fit. And sometimes that means that certain pieces are focused on to the exclusion of others, or that some pieces are that there's nuancing that's missed. But I think the important thing is that the data get used to kind of support questions. And to actually inspire other questions or other policies of, we know this is to be the case, right? This is something we have answered. What is the new question we need to ask? We know people want subsidies. Well, what type of subsidies do they want? We know people want jobs. What kind of jobs do they want? How do we help them get jobs, right? So I think if our survey would be most beneficial to be used as kind of a building block for kind of something that's next, that's from the policy world. From the academic world, of course, I think to kind of to put together these theories and test these hypotheses with these data that are generalizable on a national level and that are there over time. I think at the end of the day, in service of creating knowledge on the region, that most importantly takes into account what people on the ground are saying, right? That at the end of the day, that research on MENA benefits people in MENA, be that through kind of the production of an academic work or through kind of policy implementation.
Well put, and what a fantastic project it is. So congratulations again to you and all the team at Barometer. And thank you for choosing MEI to help you get the word out. It's our pleasure. And thank you, Hafsa and Michael, for joining us late in your evenings. Really appreciate your insights and the research and work that both of you are doing. Thank you all to our listeners, and stay tuned. There are 2 more of these presentations to come on climate and gender in the next couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Thanks.